Picture a private rail car slipping out of Jersey City late at night in 1910. Names unspoken. Inside, a handful of America's most powerful financiers sit shoulder to shoulder, heading south toward Jekyll Island, off the coast of Georgia. They tell the world they're going on a duck hunting trip, but the hunt is a blind. Because behind closed doors, the real target isn't ducks. It's the blueprint for a new central banking system, the plan that would later become the Federal Reserve. A plan that was meant to be drafted in secrecy, so total that even admitting the meeting happened was forbidden. And yet, 3 of the wealthiest men in America stood in the way. Men with the influence to challenge it, stall it, maybe even stop it. But the people behind the plan weren't just bankers. They were connected to the secret order of the Jesuits, and they needed a vehicle so absurd, so unthinkable, that no one would call it what it was. And that vehicle was the Titanic. This video presents documented facts with extensive research, citations, and references for further reading. Feel free to draw your own conclusions. At the time of Titanic's voyage, the US did not yet have the Federal Reserve Central Bank. However, centralization of control over financial resources was far advanced by 1910. In the United States, there were 2 main focal points of this control: the Morgan Group and the Rockefeller Group. An article appeared in the New York Times on May 3, 1931, commenting on the death of George Baker, one of Morgan's closest associates. It said, 1/6 of the total wealth of the world was represented by members of the Jekyll Island Club. In 1910, 7 powerful men secretly met on Jekyll Island, just off the coast of Georgia, with the goal of designing a new central banking system for the United States. They would later call it the Federal Reserve Bank. These men were Nelson Aldrich and Frank Vanderlip, both representing the Rockefeller financial empire. Henry Davison, Charles Norton, and Benjamin Strong, representing J.P. Morgan, and Paul Warburg, representing the Rothschild banking dynasty of Europe. The Rothschilds were the banking agents for the papacy's Jesuits, holding the key to the wealth of the Roman Catholic Church. The group drafted what became known as the Aldrich Plan, a proposal for a central banking system. Although the plan itself was not passed into law, it laid the foundation for what would eventually become the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. For many years after the event, educators, commentators, and historians denied that the Jekyll Island meeting ever took place. However, the first leak regarding this meeting found its way into print in 1916, appearing in Leslie's Weekly and written by a young financial reporter by the name of B.C. Forbes, who later founded Forbes magazine. He wrote the following.
Picture a party of the nation's greatest bankers stealing out of New York on a private railroad car under cover of darkness, stealthily hieing hundreds of miles south, embarking on a mysterious launch, sneaking onto an island deserted by all but a few servants, living there a full week under such rigid secrecy that the names of not one of them was once mentioned, lest the servants learn the identity and disclose to the world this strangest, most secret expedition in the history of American finance. I am not romancing. I am giving to the world, for the first time, the real story of how the famous Aldrich Currency Report, the foundation of our new currency system, was written.
In 1930, Paul Warburg wrote a massive book, 1,750 pages in all, entitled The Federal Reserve System, Its Origin and Growth. In this tome, he described the meeting and its purpose, but did not mention either its location or the names of those who attended. But he did say, the results of the conference were entirely confidential. Even the fact there had been a meeting was not permitted to become public. However, an interesting insight to Paul Warburg's attendance at the Jekyll Island meeting came 34 years later, in a book written by his son, James. This part of the story was corroborated in the official biography of Senator Aldrich, written by Nathaniel Wright Stevenson.
In the autumn of 1910, 6 men, in addition to Aldrich, went out to shoot ducks. That is to say, they told the world that was their purpose. Mr. Warburg, who was of the number, gives an amusing account of his feelings when he boarded a private car in Jersey City, bringing with him all the accoutrements of a duck shooter. The joke was in the fact that he had never shot a duck in his life and had no intention of shooting any. The duck shoot was a blind.
Unfortunately, three powerful men could have influenced an opposition of a central bank: John Jacob Astor IV, Benjamin Guggenheim, and Isidor Straus, three of the wealthiest and most influential figures in America at the time. Eliminating these men would remove significant resistance to the establishment of the Federal Reserve and establish a government-backed, Jesuit-influenced central bank. Although the Morgans, Rothschilds, and Rockefellers initially competed fiercely with one another, they eventually chose cooperation over conflict. G. Edward Griffin explains this relationship in The Creature from Jekyll Island.
The Morgans were friendly competitors with the Rothschilds and became socially close to them. Morgan's London-based firm was saved from financial ruin in 1857 by the Bank of England, over which the Rothschilds held great influence. Thereafter, Morgan appears to have served as a Rothschild financial agent and went to great length to appear totally American. Rockefeller's entry into the field was not welcomed by Morgan, and they became fierce competitors. Eventually, they decided to minimize their competition by entering into joint ventures. In the end, they worked together to create a national banking cartel called the Federal Reserve System.
At this point, it's important to clarify something. When this video talks about the Catholic Church, it is not speaking of the faithful church members who know nothing about things like this. It is speaking of the rulers of the Vatican and their order of the Jesuits. Many may take exception to the upcoming facts, but my goal is to simply present the facts as they are and as they happened. If you want a video explaining the origins of the Jesuits, let me know. The Jesuits appeared to be desperate to establish another central bank in the United States, one that would serve as a virtually unlimited source of funding for wars and other global operations. The building of the Titanic began in 1909 at a shipyard in Belfast, the capital of Northern Ireland. The vessel was part of a larger fleet operated by the White Star Line, an international shipping company that was also owned by J.P. Morgan. Griffin's book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, explains Morgan's financial reach.
Banking was not the only business in which Morgan had a strong financial interest. Using his control over the nation's railroads as financial leverage, he had created an international shipping trust which included Germany's two largest lines plus one of the two in England, the White Star Lines.
This so-called unsinkable ship would serve as the vessel through which those opposing the Jesuits' plan for a Federal Reserve System would be removed. As certain wealthy and powerful individuals had the influence to block the establishment of a Federal Reserve, which we'll get into later, they had to be destroyed by a means so preposterous that no one would suspect that they were murdered, and no one would suspect the Jesuits. The Titanic was this vehicle of their destruction. To further shield the papacy and the Jesuits from suspicion, large numbers of Irish, French, and Italian Roman Catholics immigrating to the New World were aboard the Titanic. These people were expendable, among them Protestants from Belfast, who wanted to immigrate to the United States. Most importantly, however, were three of the wealthiest men alive at the time, all of whom were invited on board: Benjamin Guggenheim, heir to a mining fortune, Isidor Straus, the head of Macy's department stores, and John Jacob Astor, probably the wealthiest man in the world. Their total wealth at that time, using dollar values of their day, was more than $500 million. Today, that amount of money would be worth nearly $17 billion. Allegedly, these men had to be destroyed because the Jesuits knew they could use their wealth and influence to oppose a Federal Reserve Bank. Interestingly, J.P. Morgan himself never sailed on Titanic. Morgan had reserved an opulent private suite aboard the ship, complete with a personal promenade deck and a custom bath fitted with cigar holders. He was photographed at the ship's launch in 1911 and was widely expected to join the maiden voyage in April 1912. Yet he cancelled his passage at the last moment and remained in Europe, reportedly staying at a French resort in Aix-les-Bains. He even reportedly had several valuable bronze statues removed from the ship at the last moment, indicating he knew what was coming. Even stranger, several other prominent individuals also cancelled their Titanic trips or missed the boat. American chocolate magnate Milton Hershey, industrialist Henry Clay Frick, and railroad executive Alfred Vanderbilt all had plans or tickets to sail on Titanic and changed them before departure. But the coincidences just keep getting stranger. Captain Edward Smith was the captain of the Titanic, had been travelling the North Atlantic waters for 26 years and was the world's most experienced master of the North Atlantic routes. As rumour goes, he had worked for Jesuit J.P. Morgan for many years. Edward Smith was a Jesuit tempore coadjutor, meaning that he was not a priest, but he was a Jesuit of the short robe. Several significant details emerge at this point. When the Titanic departed southern England on April 10, 1912, Francis Brown, a Jesuit priest, boarded the ship. Brown was described as the most powerful Jesuit in Ireland and reportedly answered directly to the general of the Jesuit order in Rome. A National Geographic videotape titled "The Secrets of the Titanic" highlighted one of these inconsistencies.
A vacationing priest, Father Francis Brown, caught these poignant snapshots of his fellow passengers, most of them on a voyage to eternity. The next day, Titanic made her last stop off the coast of Queenstown, Ireland. Here, tenders brought out the last passengers, mostly Irish immigrants headed for new homes in America. And here, the lucky Father Brown disembarked. Father Brown caught Captain Smith peering down from Titanic's bridge, poised on the brink of destiny.
Likewise, Eric J. Phelps reported on the strange convenience of these events.
Here is Jesuit treachery at its finest. The provincial, Father Francis Brown, boards Titanic, photographs the victims, most assuredly briefs the captain concerning his oath as a Jesuit, and the following morning bids him farewell.
Brown went over with Edward Smith one last time exactly what he was supposed to do in the North Atlantic waters. The Jesuit general then communicated the plan to Brown, who then relayed it to Smith, and the rest is history. Writer R.W. Thompson described the Jesuit oath, the oath that Smith gave.
The Jesuit general is the god of the Jesuit society. He gives the word of command. Each member springs instantaneously to his feet, leaving unfinished whatsoever may have engaged him, ready to assail whomsoever he may require to be assailed, and to strike wheresoever he shall direct a blow to be stricken.
And so, Smith was given an order to sink the Titanic, and that is exactly what he did. The loss of life is not important to Smith, as he believes he is serving his purpose. W.C. Brownlee, in Secret Instructions of the Jesuits, described the extent of this obedience.
By the command of God, the Jesuit general, it is lawful to murder the innocent, to rob, to commit all lewdness, because he, the Pope, is Lord of life and death and of all things, and thus to fulfill his mandate is our duty.
Similarly, G.B. Niccolini, in the History of the Jesuits, wrote,
"The ends justify the means," is his favorite maxim, and as his only end, as we have shown, is the order. At its bidding, the Jesuit is ready to commit any crime whatsoever.
Although this video does not explore the Jesuit order in depth, we must remember that every person takes an oath to become a part of the Jesuit order. When a person takes the Jesuit oath, he is bound to his master until the day that he dies.
I should regard myself as a dead body, without will or intelligence, as a little crucifix which is timid about unresistingly at the will of him who holds it as a staff in the hands of an old man, who uses it as he requires it, and as it suits him best.
Edward Smith had become a man without will or intelligence, and he would commit any crime the order wanted him to commit. One final piece of evidence backs this up even further. While aboard, Father Brown befriended a wealthy American couple who were so charmed by him that they offered to pay his way to continue on Titanic to New York. Flattered, Brown telegraphed his Jesuit superior, asking permission to accept this free passage. The reply from his provincial superior came back emphatically. "Get off that ship, provincial." In a hurry, Brown left Titanic in Ireland, with the telegraph essentially a veiled warning that the Jesuit leadership knew the ship was doomed. After 3 days at sea, with only one pair of glasses for the bridge, Edward Smith propelled the Titanic full speed ahead, 22 knots, on a moonless, dark night through a gigantic ice field, nearly 80 square miles in area. Edward Smith did this despite at least 8 telegrams warning him to be more cautious because he was going too fast. At this point, an incredible amount of strange details arise. First, all of Titanic's signal rockets were white. Normally, red flares are the universal signal of distress at sea. White flares would have signalled to passing freighters that everybody was having a party. Sure enough, crew on the nearby Californian saw white rockets from a distance and weren't sure what they meant. It seems that to prevent nearby freighters from responding with help, the distress flares were white when they should have been red. Second, Captain Smith acted incredibly strangely. Smith was one of the most experienced sea captains of his day, yet he drove Titanic at high speed into a region of known icebergs on a moonless night. He also ignored at least 6 ice warnings from other ships that day. Did Edward Smith need one caution? No, he had been travelling those waters for 26 years. He knew there were icebergs in that area. But cautions would not stop a man who was under the Jesuit oath and under orders to destroy the Titanic. Smith's behaviour gets even stranger, and the encyclopedias paint a very tragic picture of Smith in his last hours. When it came time to give the order to load and lower the lifeboats, Smith wavered and one of his aides had to approach him for the order to be given. Smith's legendary skills of leadership seemed to have left him. He was curiously indecisive and unusually cautious on that fatal night. Are these words to describe a legendary sea captain with 26 years of experience? I would again point out that Father Brown was allegedly Smith's handler who gave Smith final orders to ignore all ice warnings and ram an iceberg at full speed. Brown disembarked in Ireland, surviving, and Smith followed the mission to ensure the ship's doom. Worse still, the Titanic famously didn't carry nearly enough lifeboats for everyone. Only 20 boats for about 2,200 people, when over 48 were possible. Originally, 64 lifeboats were designed, later cut to 32, then to 20. Second Officer Lightoller also appeared to have deliberately underfilled the boats, as Boat 1 had just 12 people despite 40 capacity. In the end, Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidor Straus, and John Jacob Astor all perished aboard the Titanic, while JP Morgan cancelled his ticket and remained safely in Europe. Late on the night of the 15th of April, White Star reported a message was received saying Titanic had sunk, but all passengers and crew had been transferred to another vessel. Later that day, confirmation came through that Titanic had been lost and that most of the passengers and crew had died. The US Senate's inquiry into the disaster was initiated on the 19th of April 1920. Likewise, the British Board of Trade's inquiry into the disaster was headed by Lord Mersey and took place between the 2nd of May and 3rd July. The two inquiries reached broadly similar conclusions. The regulations on the number of lifeboats that ships had to carry were out of date and inadequate. Captain Smith had failed to take proper heed of ice warnings. The lifeboats had not been properly filled or crewed, and the collision was the direct result of steaming into a dangerous area at too high a speed. As to why all these seemingly obvious mistakes were made, we now know why. By late April 1912, after the Titanic sank, all opposition to the Federal Reserve vanished. The original Aldrich Plan was dealt a fatal blow in 1912, when Democrats won the White House and Congress, but amendments were made to transfer control of the Board of Directors, called the Federal Open Market Committee in the Federal Reserve Act, to the government. In December of 1913, just a year later, the Federal Reserve System came into being in the United States. The House voted on December 22, 1913, with 298 voting yes to 60 voting no. The Senate voted 43 to 25 on December 23, 1913, and President Woodrow Wilson signed the bill later that day. 8 months later, World War I began. Although I won't dive into the connection in this video, I will quickly note one thing. Charles M. Hayes, a Titanic victim, had remarks before sailing that an enormous war in the near future could disrupt shipping. He died, and 2 years later war broke out, with the Federal Reserve available to finance the Allied war effort. But just another coincidence. One more thing. In 1898, 14 years before Titanic, author Morgan Robertson wrote a novella about a giant luxury liner called the Titan that hits an iceberg and sinks, with great loss of life due to lack of lifeboats. The similarities to the real Titanic disaster 14 years later are hard to overlook, and even the name is nearly identical. Even stranger, Robertson died mysteriously in 1915 from an accidental overdose, and we all know what that means. In fact, the New York Times obituary says he was found standing with his head resting against a dresser. It says paraldehyde, a drug used at that time as an anticonvulsant, hypnotic and sedative, was found on his dresser. Some have suggested that Robertson was an insider who knew and that he died mysteriously in 1915 as a possible victim of silencing. Although I don't want to rush to any conclusions, the timing and cause of death is incredibly strange. Regardless, when you add up Morgan not boarding, others not boarding, key rivals all dying, the timing with the Federal Reserve's creation shortly after, and various strange occurrences on board, the probability of all that being mere chance do seem unlikely. But of course, these are just the facts. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and if you found this worthwhile, please consider liking and subscribing. These videos require a huge amount of research, digging, and editing to put together.